are you?
Very well, thank you.
Yeah. You are a pretty lady. Do you get tired of people talking about your looks and how stunning you are all the time? I mean, it can get to be, you know. I mean, I don't. I mean, when people tell me.
For decades, The Tonight Show welcomed presidents, icons, and some of the most recognizable faces in history. Yet, a rare group of guests brought something far more unforgettable to the stage. A presence that instantly captured America's attention. They did not rely on scandals or headlines. They simply commanded the room the moment they appeared. Across 30 years, Johnny Carson interviewed thousands, but only a select few made the famous desk seem too small for the energy they carried. These are the guests audiences could never look away from, including one whose appearance left even Carson visibly shaken in a way viewers never forgot. The woman who turned a talk show into a performance. Most guests who sat across from Johnny Carson came prepared with a story, a movie to promote, and a joke or two they had tested in the green room. Ann-Margret came prepared to perform, which is an entirely different thing, and the distinction was visible from the moment she appeared. She arrived on The Tonight Show at a point in her career when her reputation had already been established through film and live performance, but what she brought to Carson's set was not the composed celebrity interview that most guests delivered. It was something closer to the experience of watching a performer who cannot entirely turn it off, even in a context that theoretically requires sitting still and answering questions. Ann-Margret had built her career on a quality that is genuinely difficult to manufacture. She made every room she entered feel like it had been waiting for her. She had trained as a performer from childhood, and the physical discipline that comes from that kind of background is visible in the way she carries herself through even an ordinary conversation. There is intention in every gesture, a precision that is not stiff but controlled. And that control creates the paradoxical effect of making everything she does look completely natural. Her path to Carson's desk had run through some of the most significant entertainment contexts of her era. She had performed in Las Vegas residencies that established her as one of the premier live entertainers of the 1960s. She had made films alongside Elvis Presley that generated the kind of on-screen chemistry audiences discussed for years afterward. She had received Academy Award nominations that confirmed what people who saw her live already knew, that she was considerably more than a beautiful face with good timing. What made her Tonight Show appearances remarkable was the way she engaged with the format itself. Carson was skilled at managing guests, at directing conversation toward the moments he wanted to reach and away from the ones that didn't serve the show. With Ann-Margret, that dynamic shifted. She was not uncooperative or difficult, but she was so fully present as a performer that the usual host-guest architecture bent around her rather than containing her. Carson himself responded differently to her than he did to most guests. He was a man who maintained careful professional distance, who was famously guarded in his personal interactions even with people he genuinely liked. With Ann-Margret, something relaxed. He smiled differently. He leaned in. He let the conversation go where she took it, rather than steering it back to his prepared questions, which for Carson was a notable departure from his usual approach. The specific texture of what made her impossible to look away from is worth trying to articulate, because it was not simply beauty, though she was extraordinarily beautiful, and it was not simply charisma, though she had that in abundance. It was the combination of physical presence and genuine warmth, the sense that she was actually interested in the conversation, actually pleased to be in the room, and that her pleasure was not performed for the audience, but real. In a format that rewards the performance of authenticity over actual authenticity, she managed to bring the latter. Her Tonight Show appearances have aged in a specific way that is different from how most archival late-night footage ages. Rather than feeling like artifacts of their era, they feel like documents of a particular kind of performer that the entertainment industry has become less capable of producing. Someone for whom performance is not a mode they enter, but a quality that simply emanates from them, whether they intend it or not. When Ann-Margret left the desk, the show felt different. That is the clearest measure of what she brought. Now Ann-Margret bent the format around her energy. The next guest on this list did something subtler but in some ways more interesting. She arrived carrying one of the most intense public images of her era and quietly dismantled it inside 30 minutes, without appearing to try. The supermodel who made Carson's classic set feel contemporary. Christie Brinkley arrived on The Tonight Show at the precise moment her cultural presence was at its most intense, and the way she handled that intensity said something important about who she was beneath the image that had made her one of the most recognizable faces in the world. By the time she sat across from Carson, she had appeared on the cover of Sports Illustrated's swimsuit issue 3 consecutive times, which was not just a modeling achievement, but a cultural event. Those covers generated a level of public attention that was, even by the standards of the 1980s, unusual. She had become, in a very specific sense, the physical embodiment of a particular American idea of beauty, which is both an extraordinary position to occupy and an extraordinarily limiting one. What The Tonight Show appearances revealed was that the person inhabiting that image was considerably more interesting than the image itself suggested. Brinkley had a natural ease in conversation that is rarer than it looks. She was self-deprecating without being falsely modest, funny without trying too hard, and genuinely engaged with the exchange rather than waiting for it to be over so she could return to the controlled environment of a photo shoot. Carson's relationship with extraordinarily beautiful women was something he navigated with a particular combination of appreciation and professionalism. He was not the host who turned every attractive guest's appearance into an extended exercise in obvious commentary. He acknowledged what was in front of him and then moved the conversation to more interesting ground, which was itself a form of respect, and which tended to produce better television than the alternative. With Brinkley, he found a genuine conversational partner. She was willing to discuss the absurdities of the modeling world with enough detachment to make it clear she understood them as absurdities, which was not the obvious position for someone whose career depended on that world. She could talk about being photographed in remote locations, in impractical conditions, with the humor of someone who had decided to find the experience funny rather than glamorous. And that decision, clearly made consciously, gave her interviews a texture that distinguished them from the promotional appearances most models delivered. The contrast she created with Carson's set was itself interesting. The Tonight Show under Carson had a specific visual language, wood paneling, a particular shade of neutral, the studied casualness of late-night television that was trying to look like it wasn't trying. Brinkley brought a quality of light into that environment that was not just about her appearance, but about her energy, something bright and easy-moving that made the standard late-night palette feel slightly more alive. What the cameras captured was also the beginning of what would become a long public life for Brinkley that extended well beyond her modeling years. The intelligence and humor that were visible in those early Carson appearances turned out to be consistent qualities rather than interview day performances. She was building a public persona in those moments that would sustain her through decades of subsequent attention, and it was built on something more durable than a magazine cover. She arrived as an image and left as a person, which is the best thing a guest can do with 30 minutes on a late-night couch. The next woman on this list did something Carson almost never allowed anyone to do. She caught him genuinely off balance, repeatedly, and he loved every second of it. The one whose laughter changed the whole dynamic. Diane Cannon's appearances on The Tonight Show operated on a frequency that was entirely her own, and what set them apart from virtually every other guest of her era was the specific quality of her relationship with Carson, which had a history behind it that the audience could sense without being able to fully account for. Cannon had been one of Hollywood's most compelling presences through the 1960s and 70s, earning an Academy Award nomination and establishing herself as an actress capable of genuine comedic and dramatic range. But what she brought to Carson's desk was not the standard actress promoting her latest project energy. It was something more personal and more interesting, the particular ease of someone who knew the host well enough to tease him and trusted the audience enough to let them watch. The teasing was the thing. Cannon had a way of catching Carson slightly off balance, of landing a comment that reframed the conversation in a way he hadn't anticipated, and then breaking into genuine laughter at her own success. That laughter was disarming in the most literal sense. It made it impossible to maintain any formal distance, which was Carson's usual mode with guests, and which he usually controlled very precisely. Carson was famously difficult to genuinely surprise. He had interviewed so many people, had developed such refined instincts for where a conversation was going, that authentic moments of being caught off guard were rare. Cannon caught him off guard regularly, and his responses in those moments, a slight widening of the eyes, a pause just long enough to register that something unexpected had happened before he recovered, were some of the more genuinely unguarded moments Carson produced on television. Her beauty was not the kind that asked to be acknowledged and then moved past. It was the kind that became more visible the longer she talked, because it was connected to the animation of her face when she was genuinely amused, the specific quality of her attention when she was interested in something, the way she leaned forward slightly when she had something to say that she found genuinely funny. She had been married to Cary Grant, which gave her biography an almost mythological dimension, but she wore that history lightly in interviews, deploying it when it was useful and setting it aside when it wasn't. She was not defined by who she had been married to, and her Carson appearances made that clear without needing to argue the point. What the segments documented was a version of late-night television that required genuine human chemistry between host and guest, because without it, the format produced nothing of lasting interest. Cannon generated those moments reliably, which is why her appearances are among the ones that television historians return to when they try to explain what The Tonight Show was actually capable of at its peak. She walked in knowing exactly who she was, sat down without adjusting herself to fit the format, and let the conversation find its own shape. 3 guests in, and the pattern is becoming clear. The ones who made Carson's show genuinely memorable weren't the ones who came most prepared. They were the ones who came most themselves. The next guest understood that instinctively, and she demonstrated it in the most unexpected way possible, by arriving injured, refusing to cancel, and producing one of the most watchable segments in the show's history. The actress who arrived injured and stayed unforgettable. Teri Garr's Tonight Show appearances deserve to be in any serious conversation about what made Carson's show remarkable, not because she was the most famous guest or the most conventionally glamorous, but because she understood something about the format that most guests never quite figured out. That the best interviews happened when the guest was willing to be genuinely themselves, rather than a polished representative of their public image. Garr had built a career on a specific kind of intelligence. The ability to be funny without signaling that she was trying to be funny. To deliver a line with enough deadpan control that the comedy arrived a beat after the words, in the pause where the audience caught up with what had just happened. She had done it in films, she had done it in previous television appearances, and she brought that same quality to Carson's desk in a way that made the interaction feel less like an interview and more like a conversation between two people who both understood comedy at a structural level. One of the more memorable aspects of her Tonight Show appearances was the specific contrast she created between what she looked like and how she behaved. She was a striking woman who consistently refused to treat her appearance as the most interesting thing about her, which in the context of The Tonight Show's history of beautiful guests was itself a distinctive choice. She made jokes at her own expense with the comfort of someone who was not performing self-deprecation, but genuinely finding herself funny, which is a harder quality to locate than it sounds. On one occasion, she arrived visibly injured, having hurt herself before the appearance, and rather than canceling or concealing the injury, she appeared anyway and let it become part of the conversation. That decision revealed something about her approach to performance generally. She was more interested in what was actually happening than in managing the appearance of what was happening, and that priority produced television that felt alive in a way that more carefully managed appearances did not. Carson responded to Garr the way he responded to guests who gave him something real to work with genuine engagement. He was more himself, more willing to be surprised, more present in the conversation when the guest brought actual spontaneity rather than prepared material. Garr brought spontaneity consistently, which made their dynamic one of the more reliably entertaining on the show. Her appearances also documented something about the specific cultural moment she occupied in Hollywood, a period when actresses were being asked to be both conventionally glamorous and genuinely funny in ways that the industry had not previously demanded of women simultaneously. She managed that combination with apparent ease, though the apparent ease was itself a product of considerable skill. Making something difficult look simple is the fundamental technical achievement of all great performers, and Garr did it so consistently that it was easy to underestimate how hard it actually was. She gave Carson some of his best moments because she never gave him the expected moment. Every time the conversation appeared to be heading toward a predictable outcome, she found a different direction, and the show was better for it every single time. The young star who showed Carson something forming in real time. Brooke Shields appeared on The Tonight Show at a moment in her public life that was genuinely unusual. She was already one of the most famous people in America, having generated a level of cultural attention that most adults never achieve, while still being young enough that who she actually was had not yet fully solidified. The combination of extreme visibility and ongoing formation produced something in those Carson appearances that is genuinely rare in archival television. The experience of watching someone in the process of becoming rather than already having arrived. She had been photographed, written about, and discussed since childhood in ways that created a public image of her before she had any real capacity to shape it. The cultural conversation around Brooke Shields in her early years was largely conducted by adults who had different stakes in the conversation than she did, and who used her image for purposes that ranged from artistic to commercial to simply exploitative. What The Tonight Show appearances offered was a different kind of view. Shields in conversation, required to be present and responsive in real time, without the mediation of a photograph or a film character between her and the audience. What came through was composure. Not the composed blankness of someone managing an uncomfortable situation, but the genuine composure of a person who had been in the public eye long enough to be comfortable there, who had figured out how to be watched without being destabilized by the watching. That quality, at her age, was remarkable. It suggested that beneath the intense public scrutiny of her early years, something structurally sound was developing. Carson treated her with a specific care that was visible to anyone watching. He was not soft or excessively solicitous, but he was attentive in a way that reflected his understanding that he was talking to someone who had been managed by adults with agendas for most of her public life, and who deserved a conversation that let her be herself, rather than performing a version of herself that served someone else's interests. She talked about animals with genuine enthusiasm, about her experiences at university with the specific pleasure of someone who had found a context in which she was not primarily famous, about the ordinary texture of a life that was, despite everything, still in many ways ordinary. Those moments of ordinariness, visible alongside the obvious sophistication of someone who had navigated extraordinary circumstances, created the particular fascination of those appearances. What The Tonight Show captured was Brooke Shields at the specific hinge point between the public image that had been constructed around her and the person she was in the process of deciding to be. That hinge point is genuinely interesting to watch in retrospect, because the subsequent decades of her public life can be traced back to qualities that were already visible in those conversations: the intelligence, the humor, the refusal to be reduced to the image, and the underlying determination to control her own narrative that would eventually produce one of the more thoughtful and self-aware public lives of her generation. She arrived as an image and insisted, quietly and without making a point of it, on being a person. Carson let that happen, and the result was television worth keeping. Everything so far has been about guests who found ways to work within the format, or around it, or despite it. The next guest did none of those things. The one who flipped the power dynamic entirely. Jane Fonda's Tonight Show appearances occupy a specific place in the show's history, because she was one of the few guests who arrived with enough cultural authority to reshape the conversation, rather than simply participate in it. She was not there to be interviewed in the conventional sense. She was there to engage, which is a meaningfully different thing, and the distinction produced segments that feel genuinely different from the surrounding material in the archives. By the time she was a regular Carson guest, Fonda had accumulated a biography that was, by any measure, extraordinary. She had won Academy Awards. She had been at the center of some of the most contentious political controversies of the 1970s in ways that made her a genuinely polarizing figure to a significant portion of the American public. She had reinvented herself commercially through the fitness industry in ways that demonstrated a business acumen that the entertainment world had not fully anticipated. She was, in short, a person with a lot of layers, and the Tonight Show format, which tends to reward surface engagement, had to work harder than usual to accommodate her. What made her appearances so watchable was the quality of her attention. She listened differently than most guests. She was interested in the conversation rather than in managing it, which meant she was willing to take it places that had not been planned, including places that put Carson in the position of responding rather than leading. For a host who maintained such careful control over the temperature and direction of his show, guests who shifted that control without being adversarial were genuinely valuable. And Fonda did it with such evident good humor that it never felt like a challenge. She was also one of the few guests who could discuss her own controversial history without either defensiveness or the performative regret that public figures often deploy when addressing their past. She had done things she knew were polarizing, had made choices that generated real anger in real people, and she engaged with that history with a directness that was refreshing precisely because it did not seek the audience's forgiveness. She was explaining, not apologizing, and the distinction was audible. Her physical presence was also, in the most straightforward sense, remarkable. She was one of the most physically disciplined people in a room that had seen most of Hollywood's best-looking people. And the combination of that physical precision with the evident sharpness of her mind created an effect that was distinctly her own. There was nothing soft about how she occupied a space, no quality of waiting to be engaged with, only the forward energy of someone who had decided what she thought and was prepared to discuss it. Carson managed her carefully, which is the right word, not controlled her, but managed the exchange with enough skill to let her be fully present without letting the interview become something other than an interview. It was the kind of hosting that looks effortless and is not, and it produced some of the most genuinely interesting conversational television of his tenure. Fonda came in with more than she was asked to bring and left the desk slightly charged, the way a room feels after someone who generates real energy has been in it. The legend who made everyone adjust to her rhythm. Lauren Bacall appeared on The Tonight Show as a representative of a Hollywood that was already historical by the time she sat across from Carson, and the specific weight of that history was visible in every aspect of how she held herself, conducted the conversation, and treated the format itself. She had made her film debut alongside Humphrey Bogart in 1944 in a picture that generated one of the most discussed on-screen chemistry stories in cinema history. She had been a genuine movie star in the era when movie stars occupied a cultural position that no subsequent version of fame has quite replicated. She had survived Bogart's death, rebuilt her career on her own terms, and arrived at Carson's desk as someone who had been through things that most of his guests could only reference secondhand. What she brought to the format was a quality of unhurriedness that was genuinely unusual. Carson ran a tight show. Segments had shapes, conversations had arcs, and there was always a next thing that needed to happen. Bacall operated at her own pace, deliberate and unhurried in a way that didn't feel rude but simply reflected the authority of someone who had never been required to accelerate for anyone else's convenience. Her voice was itself a presence. The particular register she occupied, that famous low, controlled instrument that had been her trademark since her first film, had not diminished with time. And in the intimate context of a television studio, it was even more striking than it had been projected from a cinema screen. She spoke without performing the act of speaking, which sounds unremarkable, until you notice how rarely it actually happens in a context where performance is the entire point. Carson's response to Bacall was one of the clearest demonstrations of his abilities as a host. He understood that some guests required a different approach, that trying to move Bacall at standard Tonight Show pace would produce a lesser version of what she could offer, and that the right thing to do was to slow down and let her speak at the pace at which her stories actually arrived. He was right. The Bogart stories she told were not gossip or anecdote. They were primary source history from someone who had been in the room, and they needed the space she gave them. There was also a specific kind of glamour that Bacall carried that was different in kind from the other guests on this list. It was not the glamour of careful presentation or deliberate style, though she was always impeccably presented. It was the glamour of someone who had lived inside a remarkable period of cultural history and retained its quality of seriousness. Her Tonight Show appearances documented the passage of time in the most interesting possible way. By showing that certain qualities do not diminish, but simply become more concentrated as the person who carries them continues to live. Bacall at any age was more compelling than most people at their most carefully prepared. That is not something you can manufacture. It is something you earn. The one who walked in and immediately owned every inch of the room. Dolly Parton's Tonight Show appearances belong in a category that has very few members. The guests whose arrival did not just fill the space they entered, but genuinely transformed it. Within moments of sitting down, the entire atmospheric quality of the show changed. This was not something Parton engineered through any specific technique. It was simply what happened when someone who contains that much warmth and that much wit entered a formal television context. She had built a career that was, even by the standards of country music's most successful artists, remarkable. She had written hundreds of songs, including some of the most covered in popular music history. She had built a business empire alongside her artistic one. She had maintained a public persona across several decades of intense scrutiny without losing anything essential about who she appeared to be. And she brought all of that to Carson's desk with the apparent effortlessness of someone who was simply having a conversation. The specific quality that made her impossible to look away from was the combination of absolute authenticity and complete self-awareness. She knew exactly how she appeared to the world, understood the joke of her own image with crystalline precision, and was one step ahead of any observation an interviewer might make about it. She could make the joke before you made it, make it funnier than you would have, and then look at you with an intelligence that her image had consistently caused people to underestimate. That gap between how she appeared and how sharp she actually was itself the thing she had learned to deploy with complete precision. Carson was not someone who underestimated people, but even he could be observed recalibrating in her presence. The speed of her wit surprised him in the best way. The depth of her self-possession gave him nothing to manage or redirect. She was not a guest who needed hosting in the usual sense. She needed a conversational partner. And Carson, at his best, was exactly that. The warmth she projected was also not a performance, which is the thing that is hardest to fake and most immediately detectable when it is genuine. She was actually interested in Carson, actually pleased to be on the show, actually delighted by the conversation in a way that had nothing to do with promotional strategy. That authenticity made every exchange feel like something was genuinely at stake. She walked in and owned the room, not because she demanded ownership, but because she offered so much genuine engagement that the room simply reorganized itself around her. That is the rarest quality in entertainment, and she brought it every single time. Which other guest do you think should have made our list? Share with us in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. For more interesting stories like this, be sure to click on the next video that pops up on your screen. You never know what you'll discover next.